The transport ship landed on Nexus Prime with a soft hum. Steam rose from its engines as the doors opened. Students from across the galaxy stepped out onto the platform. There were tall, blue-skinned Altarians with 4 arms. There were insect-like Kresh with shining black shells. There were cloud-like Nebulans floating in special suits. All of them carried bags full of recording devices, tablets, and neural interfaces. Among them walked a small human woman. Her name was Kim Nari. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and carried only a basic shoulder bag. No fancy technology, no recording equipment, just a notebook and a pen. The other students looked at her with curiosity. Humans were new to the galactic community. Earth had only been contacted 5 years ago. Most aliens still thought of humans as a primitive species that had barely learned to travel between stars. Nari walked through the corridors of the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences. The building was massive. Its walls were made of crystal that changed colors as students passed by. Floating displays showed complex equations and star maps. The air hummed with the sound of thousands of different languages being translated in real time. She found her assigned room on the 15th floor. Her roommate was a Saurian named Hyojin. Hyojin had green scales and yellow eyes that could see in multiple dimensions. She was already unpacking her collection of memory enhancement devices. "You must be the human," Hyojin said without looking up. Her voice came through a translator that made it sound musical. "I heard there was one coming this year." "Yes, I'm Nari," she replied simply. Hyojin finally looked at her. "Where are your study tools? Your neural recorders? Your quantum processors?" Nari held up her notebook. "I have this." Hyojin stared at the simple paper book. "You're joking, right? This is the most advanced institute in the galaxy. We study things that even the smartest species can barely understand. You can't survive here with just paper." "We'll see," Nari said quietly. The next morning, students gathered in the main lecture hall for orientation. The room was enormous. It could hold 3,000 students from different species. The seats adjusted automatically to fit each type of body. The air was filtered to support dozens of different breathing requirements. Professor Velterra walked onto the stage. She was an Altarian with bright blue crystalline skin. Her 4 arms moved gracefully as she spoke. She was famous across the galaxy for her work in multidimensional physics. "Welcome to the Institute," Professor Velterra said. Her voice echoed through the hall in perfect translation for every species present. "You are here because you represent the best minds your worlds have to offer. But let me be clear, most of you will fail." A nervous whisper ran through the crowd. "The courses here are not like anything you have studied before. We explore the deepest mysteries of reality itself. We study how consciousness affects matter. We learn to manipulate the very fabric of space and time. Only the strongest minds will survive." Nari listened carefully. Around her, students were already recording everything. Teclon, a Kresh sitting nearby, had multiple recording devices attached to his shell. His compound eyes tracked every movement the professor made. "Your first class begins tomorrow," Professor Velterra continued. "I will be teaching multidimensional physics and reality manipulation. It is the most difficult course we offer. I suggest you prepare yourselves." After the orientation, students gathered in small groups. They talked excitedly about the classes they would take. They compared their recording equipment and study tools. Nari walked alone to the library. It was a vast space filled with floating books, holographic displays, and knowledge crystals from 1,000 worlds. She found a quiet corner and sat down with her simple notebook. A group of students noticed her. There was Kaxan, a large saurian with purple scales. There was Morgeth, an Altarian with silver skin. There was Vesisari, a Nebulan floating in her containment suit. "Look at the human," Kaxan whispered to the others. "She thinks she can compete with us using paper and ink." "I heard humans have very poor memory," Morgeth added. "Their brains are small and inefficient. They need to write everything down just to remember basic things." "She'll be gone within a week," Vesisari said through her suit's speaker. "This place is too advanced for primitive species." Nari heard them but said nothing. She simply opened her notebook and began to write. But she wasn't taking notes about orientation. Instead, she was writing her observations about the other students. She wrote about how they relied so heavily on their machines. She wrote about how they seemed afraid of forgetting anything. The first day of classes arrived. Nari entered Professor Velterra's lecture hall early. The room was smaller than the orientation hall but still impressive. The wall showed live feeds of distant galaxies. The ceiling displayed real-time quantum field fluctuations. Other students filed in, their arms full of equipment. They set up recording devices, neural interfaces, and quantum processors. The sound of beeping and humming filled the air as machines came online. Nari took a seat in the middle of the room. She placed her notebook on the desk but didn't open it. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Professor Veltara entered and began her lecture immediately. Today we begin our exploration of consciousness-driven reality manipulation. This field combines quantum mechanics, psychology, and dimensional mathematics in ways that challenge our basic understanding of existence. Around Nari, students frantically worked their recording devices. Theklan's bioneural implant glowed as it captured every word. Dronan, another Saurian, spoke quietly into a voice recorder that translated his thoughts into mathematical notation. But Nari just listened. Her eyes focused on Professor Veltara. She watched the way the professor moved her hands when explaining complex concepts. She noticed the slight pause before each major point. She observed how the professor's skin changed color slightly when she was excited about a particular idea. Professor Veltara wrote equations on the board that stretched across multiple dimensions. The symbols seemed to move and shift as she wrote them. Consciousness, she explained, is not separate from reality. It is woven into the very structure of space and time. The lecture continued for 2 hours. Professor Veltara covered topics that would make most university professors dizzy. She talked about parallel dimensions existing in the same space. She explained how thoughts could influence quantum particles across vast distances. She demonstrated mathematical proofs that required understanding of 17 different number systems. When the lecture ended, students looked exhausted. Many of them were already reviewing their recordings, trying to understand what they had just heard. Nari closed her notebook without having written a single word during the lecture. She stood up and walked toward the exit. Professor Veltara noticed her as she passed. "Student Kim Nari," she called out. Nari stopped and turned. "Yes, Professor?" "I noticed you didn't take any notes during my lecture. Do you have questions about the material?" "No, Professor. It was very clear." Professor Veltara looked puzzled. Her crystalline features shifted slightly. "Very clear?" "We covered consciousness-reality interface theory, 17-dimensional mathematics, and quantum cognition principles. Most students find this material extremely challenging." "It is challenging," Nari agreed. "But I understood it, without taking notes, without recording anything." "Yes, Professor." The other students had stopped packing their equipment. They were listening to the conversation with growing amazement. "Student Nari," Professor Veltara said carefully, "perhaps you don't realize how complex this material is. This isn't basic physics. These are concepts that took me decades to master." Nari smiled politely. "I understand, Professor. Thank you for the lesson." She left the lecture hall, leaving behind a room full of confused aliens. Professor Veltara stared after her, wondering if the human student was incredibly confident or incredibly foolish. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Every class, every lecture, Nari sat and listened without taking notes. While other students worked frantically to record and process the information, she simply absorbed it all in silence. The other students began to whisper more loudly about her. They wondered how long she would last before failing. They bet among themselves about when she would finally break down and admit she was lost. But Professor Veltara was beginning to wonder something different. She had been teaching for over a century. She had seen thousands of brilliant students from across the galaxy. And something about the quiet human student was starting to intrigue her in ways she couldn't explain. 3 weeks had passed since classes began. Professor Veltara stood at the front of her lecture hall, watching her students work through a complex problem. The assignment was simple in concept, but nearly impossible in practice. Students had to calculate the quantum probability of consciousness existing in 17 different dimensions at the same time. Around the room, alien students struggled with the problem. Theklan's bioneural implant was overheating from the computational load. Dronan had connected 3 different quantum processors to handle the mathematics. Even Vesisari, whose gaseous form allowed her to process information in ways solid beings couldn't, was struggling. But in the middle of the room, Kim Nari sat quietly with her eyes closed. She wasn't using any equipment. She wasn't even writing. She just sat there perfectly still, as if she was sleeping. Student Nari, Professor Veltara called out. Are you working on the problem? Nari opened her eyes. Yes, Professor. I don't see any calculations. Where is your work? Nari tapped her temple with one finger. It's here. Professor Veltara walked over to Nari's desk. There was nothing on it except the closed notebook and a pen that hadn't been touched. Show me your solution. The probability is 0.847 recurring, with variance factors of 2.3 in dimensions 4 through 7 and 8.9 in dimensions 12 through 15, Nari said without hesitation. Professor Veltara checked her own calculations. Nari was correct. Not just close, exactly correct. The answer had taken Professor Veltara 40 minutes to calculate using advanced Alterian neural enhancement. Nari had done it in her head in less than 10 minutes. How did you solve it so quickly? Professor Veltara asked. I visualized the dimensional spaces and followed the consciousness threads through each layer, Nari explained simply. Then I calculated the interference patterns. The other students had stopped working to listen. They stared at Nari with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Caxon raised his scaled hand. Professor, is it possible for a mind to hold 17-dimensional mathematics without computational assistance? Theoretically, yes, Professor Veltara replied slowly. But it would require neural architecture far more advanced than any known species possesses. Maybe she's cheating, Morgeth suggested. Humans are known for their deceptive nature. She could have hidden technology. Professor Veltara was beginning to wonder the same thing, but she had scanned Nari multiple times for hidden devices. There were none. The human student was exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman with no technological enhancements. After class, Professor Veltara decided to observe Nari more carefully. She followed her to the library, staying hidden behind floating book displays. Nari found her usual quiet corner and sat down. She opened her notebook and began to write. Professor Veltara expected to see lecture notes or homework calculations. Instead, she saw something strange. Nari was writing about the other students. She wrote detailed observations about their behavior, their learning patterns, and their social interactions. It was like she was studying them as much as they were studying physics. But what surprised Professor Veltara most was how detailed the observations were. Nari had noticed things that even she, as the professor, had missed. She had recorded subtle changes in Theclon's compound eyes that indicated confusion. She had noted the exact frequency variations in Vesisari's speech patterns when she was uncertain. She had observed micro-expressions in Dronan's face that showed frustration. The human wasn't just listening to lectures. She was absorbing everything around her with incredible precision. Professor Veltara decided to test this theory. The next day, she made her lecture even more challenging. She covered consciousness-mediated quantum tunneling across parallel realities. It was material that graduate students usually studied in their third year. She spoke quickly and used advanced mathematical concepts without explanation. The alien students struggled desperately to keep up. Their recording devices worked at maximum capacity. Some students looked panicked as they fell behind, but Nari sat calmly and listened. She didn't take notes. She didn't use any devices. She just absorbed everything with the same quiet focus she always showed. During the break, Professor Veltara overheard the students talking. She's going to fail, Yixtal said confidently. He was a creche who prided himself on his perfect memory implants. No one can keep up with today's lecture without recording it. I agree, said Zara, a young Alterian. Professor Veltara spoke too fast for biological memory to process. Humans are probably too proud to admit when they're lost, Dronan added. She'll keep pretending until the first exam destroys her. But when class resumed, Professor Veltara asked questions about the material she had just covered. She called on different students randomly. Yixtal, despite his advanced memory implants, could only answer basic questions. Zara got confused about the mathematical relationships. Dronan mixed up the dimensional coordinates. Then Professor Veltara called on Nari. Student Nari, explain how consciousness affects quantum particle behavior in parallel dimensional streams. Nari stood up. Her voice was calm and clear. When consciousness observes quantum particles across parallel dimensions, it creates resonance patterns that influence probability waves. These patterns don't just affect the observed particles. They create cascading effects that can alter entire dimensional structures. She continued for 5 minutes. explaining complex concepts that some of the other students didn't even recognize. She used mathematical terms that Professor Veltara had mentioned only briefly. She made connections between ideas that weren't obvious even to advanced minds. When she finished, the lecture hall was silent. Professor Veltara stared at her human student. That explanation was more comprehensive than what I had planned to cover in today's lecture. You provided all the necessary information, Professor. I just connected the concepts together. Connected them how? I built a mental model of the dimensional framework and ran the consciousness variables through it, Nari explained. Like a simulation, but in my mind. This time, even Professor Veltara looked confused. You created a mental simulation of 17-dimensional quantum mechanics? Yes, Professor. That's impossible, Theclon said from his seat. No biological brain can process that much information simultaneously. Nari looked at him with curious eyes. How do you know what biological brains can do? Because we've studied brain capacity across hundreds of species, Theclon replied. There are limits to organic processing power. Maybe you've been studying the wrong species, Nari said simply. After class, Professor Veltara couldn't concentrate on anything else. She went to her office and contacted the Galactic Council's database. She searched for information about human neural architecture and cognitive abilities. What she found surprised her. Human brains were indeed smaller than most galactic species. They had fewer neural connections than Altarians. They lacked the parallel processing abilities of Kresh. They couldn't interface directly with quantum fields like nebulans. But there was something else. Something that the initial contact reports had missed. Human brains had an unusual property. They formed connections differently than other species. Instead of specialized regions for different functions, human neural networks were incredibly integrated. Every part of the brain could communicate with every other part in ways that created unexpected capabilities. The reports also mentioned something called human intuition. A poorly understood ability to reach correct conclusions without conscious reasoning. Galactic scientists had dismissed it as primitive superstition. Professor Veltara was beginning to think they had been wrong. The next week, she decided to conduct an experiment. She announced that the next lecture would cover the most advanced topic in the entire course, reality substrate manipulation. It was material that even she found challenging. This lecture will determine who belongs in this class and who does not, she announced. I will not repeat any information. I will not slow down for questions. If you cannot keep up, you should consider transferring to a less demanding course. The alien students activated every recording device they owned. Some had borrowed additional equipment from other students. The air filled with the hum of quantum processors and neural interfaces working at maximum capacity. Nari sat in her usual place with her usual calm expression. Her notebook remained closed. Professor Veltara began the lecture. She spoke rapidly and covered concepts that pushed the boundaries of known physics. She explained how consciousness could alter the fundamental structure of reality. She demonstrated mathematical proofs that required understanding of concepts that hadn't even been named yet. By the end of the 2-hour lecture, most students looked overwhelmed. Some were reviewing their recordings frantically, trying to understand what they had just heard. Professor Veltara looked directly at Nari. Student Nari, do you have any questions about today's material? Just one, Professor. What is it? Why did you say that consciousness alters reality substrate? Wouldn't it be more accurate to say that consciousness is reality substrate? Professor Veltara felt her forearms go still. The question revealed an understanding of the material that went beyond what she had taught. It suggested insights that she herself was still developing. Explain your reasoning, she said quietly. Nari stood up. And for the next 20, Professor Veltara stood in her office, staring out at the twin moons of Nexus Prime. 3 months had passed since the semester began, and she couldn't stop thinking about her human student. Kim Nari had continued to attend every lecture without taking notes, answer every question with perfect accuracy, and demonstrate understanding that surpassed most graduate students. The other professors had started talking about her too. Professor Grixmol from Advanced Temporal Mathematics mentioned that Nari had solved a problem in 15 minutes that typically took his best students 3 days. Professor Yundar from Consciousness Studies reported that Nari had corrected an error in his calculations that he hadn't even noticed himself. But what bothered Professor Veltara most was that she still didn't understand how Nari was doing it. Every other species in the galaxy relied on technology to enhance their natural abilities. The Kresh used bioneural implants. The Altarians used crystalline memory matrices. The Nebulans used quantum consciousness fields. Even the most gifted natural minds needed some form of assistance to handle advanced theoretical physics, yet the human student sat in class with nothing but her simple notebook and absorbed everything as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Today's lecture had been particularly challenging. Professor Veltara had covered consciousness-mediated quantum tunneling across parallel realities, material so advanced that she normally saved it for final-year students. The mathematics involved 17 different dimensional frameworks, each with its own set of quantum rules. As usual, the alien students had worked frantically to record and process the information. Theclon's bioneural implant had started smoking from the computational load. Vesasari had connected to the building's quantum computer network just to keep up. Even Morgeth, who came from a species known for mathematical ability, had looked overwhelmed, and as usual, Nari had sat quietly and listened without taking a single note. When the lecture ended, Professor Veltara made her decision. She had to know how the human was doing this. The mystery was driving her to distraction, and it was affecting her ability to teach. "Student Kim Nari," she called out as students began filing out of the lecture hall. "Please remain after class." Nari nodded and stayed in her seat while the other students left. But several of them lingered near the doorway, curious about what was going to happen. Yixtel pretended to organize his equipment while listening. Dronan moved slowly toward the exit, clearly eavesdropping. Vesasari floated near the wall, her containment suit's sensors focused on the conversation. Professor Veltara waited until most students had left, but she knew some were still listening. That was fine. Maybe it was time for everyone to understand what was happening. She walked over to Nari's desk and looked down at the young human woman. Nari looked back with calm dark eyes that seemed older than her face suggested. "Student Nari," Professor Veltara began, "I need to address something that has been concerning me for several months now." "Of course, Professor. What can I help you with?" "I have observed that you never take notes during my lectures. Not once in 3 months. You don't use recording devices. You don't employ neural enhancement. You don't even write down the equations I put on the board." Nari nodded. "That's correct, Professor. This course covers some of the most complex theoretical physics known to galactic science. The material we discussed today about consciousness-mediated quantum tunneling is so advanced that most species require years of preparation just to understand the basic concepts." "I understand." "Professor." Professor Veltara felt her crystalline skin change color slightly, a sign of frustration that she couldn't hide. "Student Nari, I don't think you do understand. Even our most gifted students struggle to retain this information without extensive technological assistance. The Kresh have perfect memory implants and they still need to review their recordings multiple times. The Altarians have neural matrices that can store and cross-reference unlimited information. And they take detailed notes on everything." She gestured toward the doorway where other students were still listening. "Every species that has achieved galactic-level intelligence has had to develop technological solutions to handle advanced learning. It's a universal requirement. No biological brain can process and retain this much complex information without help." Nari was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Professor, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you take notes when you're living your life?" Professor Veltara stopped. The question was so unexpected that it took her a moment to process what Nari had said. "I don't understand." "What do you mean?" The remaining students in the hallway moved closer. Even they seemed confused by the question. Nari stood up slowly. Her voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Professor, when you wake up in the morning, do you write down notes about how to breathe? When you walk across the room, do you record the process of moving your legs? When you think about someone you care about, do you document the steps involved in feeling emotion? No, of course not. Those are natural processes that you've internalized so completely that they become part of who you are," Nari finished. "They're not separate information that you have to remember. They're integrated into your existence." Professor Veltara's forearms moved restlessly. "Student Nari, breathing and walking are basic biological functions. What we study in this class is advanced theoretical physics. The comparison doesn't make sense. Nari was quiet for another moment, as if deciding how much to say. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, not defiant or proud, but matter-of-fact in a way that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. "Professor, may I tell you something about my species that might help explain?" "Please do." "My people learned something very early in our development that perhaps other species didn't need to learn. We learned that survival meant remembering everything, every detail, every lesson, every mistake, because forgetting could mean death." The room had gone completely silent. Even the students in the hallway stopped pretending to pack their equipment. When my ancestors lived in wild places, they couldn't stop to write notes about which plants would kill them, or which sounds meant danger was coming. When they built their first farms, they had to remember weather patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal changes all in their minds, passed down through speaking for thousands of years before we invented writing. Professor Veltara felt something shift in her understanding. "Go on." "When we built cities and faced wars, famines, and disasters, we couldn't take notes during the crisis. We had to remember how to rebuild, how to survive, how to adapt. Our entire species evolved not just to live through difficulty, but to remember survival and pass those memories forward." Nari paused and looked around the room at the alien faces, now focused entirely on her. "You see, Professor, for humans, our minds aren't just processing information like a computer. We're living it. When you explain quantum consciousness bridging, I'm not just hearing words and equations. I'm building that reality in my mind, walking through it, experiencing it, making it part of who I am." Yixtal whispered something to Dronan, but Professor Veltara couldn't make out the words. She was too focused on what Nari was saying. "We don't store information separately from ourselves and then retrieve it when needed. We absorb experiences, and they become part of our neural structure. Every lecture becomes part of who we are. Every concept becomes something we've lived through, not just learned." Professor Veltara stared at her human student. "Are you saying that humans process learning as a survival experience?" "I'm saying that for humans there is no difference between learning and surviving. They're the same thing. When we encounter new information, our minds don't ask, 'How do I remember this?' They ask, 'How do I live this?'" The silence in the room was complete now. Professor Veltara could see the other students in the hallway leaning forward, trying to understand what they were hearing. "Student Nari," she said slowly, "are you telling me that humans have evolved to treat all learning as if their lives depend on it?" "Yes, Professor. Because for most of our history it did." Professor Veltara felt something she had never experienced before. A complete reframing of everything she thought she understood about intelligence and learning. But that would mean that when a human really pays attention to something, they don't just learn it. They become it. It becomes part of their consciousness in the same way that breathing becomes part of their body. Nari picked up her simple notebook and held it gently. "You asked why I don't take notes, Professor. It's because taking notes would be like taking notes on how to be myself. The information isn't separate from me anymore. It's integrated into who I am." Professor Veltara looked at the notebook in Nari's hands. "Then what do you write in there?" For the first time since the conversation began, Nari smiled slightly. "Observations about all of you. I'm trying to understand how other species learn, since it's so different from how we do it." The professor realized with sudden clarity that while she had been studying Nari had been studying all of them. "Show me," Professor Veltara said quietly. But before Nari could respond, Tekalon spoke up from the hallway. "Professor, that's in minutes," she presented ideas that... The silence in the lecture hall stretched on for long moments. Professor Veltara's crystalline features shifted through different colors as she processed what she had just heard. The students in the hallway had stopped all pretense of leaving and now stood openly listening to the conversation. Teklon stepped forward from the doorway, his compound eyes reflecting light and agitated patterns. "Student Nari, what you're describing contradicts everything we know about neural architecture. No biological brain can integrate complex theoretical physics directly into consciousness. It's scientifically impossible." More students gathered in the hallway. Word was spreading through the building that something unusual was happening in Professor Veltara's classroom. Vesizari floated closer, her gaseous form shimmering with interest. Morgeth and several other Altarians clustered near the entrance. Even students from other classes began to appear. Nari looked at the growing crowd with calm eyes. You keep saying what's impossible for consciousness, but how many of you have ever actually tested the limits of consciousness without technological assistance? We don't need to test it, Dronan said from the hallway. We have thousands of years of scientific research. We know how biological brains work. Do you? Nari asked simply. Or do you know how technological enhancement works? Professor Veltara held up one of her 4 hands for silence. The room quieted instantly. Student Nari, I need to understand exactly what you're claiming. Are you saying that humans can process and retain advanced theoretical physics using only biological neural networks? I'm saying that humans never learn to separate their consciousness from their experience, Nari replied. When we encounter information, we don't store it separately from ourselves. We live it. But that's... Professor Veltara started, then stopped. She was struggling to find words for something that challenged her fundamental understanding of how minds worked. Nari continued speaking, her voice steady and clear. Professor, when your ancestors first developed intelligence, what did they use it for? Survival, of course. Finding food, avoiding predators, building shelter. And when they encountered a dangerous situation, did they write down notes about it, and then refer to those notes the next time they faced similar danger? No, they remembered the experience and... Professor Veltara stopped as she realized where this was leading. They remembered it as a lived experience, Nari finished. They didn't store information about danger. They became beings who had experienced danger and survived. The knowledge became part of who they were. A new voice spoke from the hallway. It was Professor Krintal from the Consciousness Studies Department. He had heard about the discussion and come to listen. Student Nari, what you're describing is how primitive minds might handle simple survival information. But we're talking about 17-dimensional mathematics and quantum consciousness theory. Nari turned to face him. Professor Krintal, why do you assume that complexity changes the fundamental nature of how consciousness works? Because complex information requires complex processing systems, he replied confidently. No biological brain has the capacity to handle advanced physics without computational assistance. Have you ever met a human before me? Nari asked. Professor Krintal paused. Well, no. Earth was only recently contacted and you're the first human to attend the institute. Then how do you know what human consciousness can do? The question hit the room like a physical force. Professor Veltara realized with sudden clarity that everything they thought they knew about human capabilities was based on assumptions and second-hand reports. No one in the galactic scientific community had actually studied human consciousness directly. More students and faculty continued to gather. The hallway was now crowded with curious aliens trying to understand what was happening. Someone must have sent a message through the academic network, because Professor Veltara could see faculty members from other departments arriving. Student Nari, Professor Veltara said carefully, if what you're suggesting is true, it would mean that humans have developed a completely different relationship with consciousness than any other known species. Yes, Professor, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. But how is that possible? Nari was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. Professor, my species learned something that maybe others didn't need to learn. We learned that forgetting could kill us. She looked around the room at the alien faces focused on her. For most of human history, we lived in a world that was actively trying to kill us. Predators, diseases, natural disasters, other humans, everything was dangerous. The humans who survived were the ones who could remember every detail of every dangerous situation and apply that knowledge instantly in new situations. Professor Veltara felt her skin changing colors rapidly. You're saying humans evolved under extreme survival pressure. I'm saying we evolved under constant survival pressure for millions of years. The humans who could integrate survival information directly into their consciousness lived. The ones who couldn't died. Over time, we became a species that treats all important information as survival information. A gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Professor Yixtel from evolutionary biology had arrived and was listening intently. That would create neural pathways completely different from any other species we've studied, he said. Yes, Nari agreed. When you grow up with technology that can store and retrieve information for you, your brain develops differently than when you grow up knowing that forgetting important information means death. Professor Veltara was beginning to understand the implications. So when you encounter complex physics, my brain treats it the same way it would treat learning about a deadly predator. It doesn't just store the information. It integrates it into my consciousness as a lived experience. The mathematics becomes something I've experienced, not just something I know. Theclon's bioneural implant was blinking rapidly as he processed this information. But that would mean humans can form neural connections that we can't even imagine. It means humans form neural connections that you haven't needed to form, Nari corrected gently. Because your species developed technology to handle complex information before you developed the biological ability to integrate it directly into consciousness. Professor Crintal stepped into the room. Student Nari, what you're describing would represent the most advanced form of consciousness integration known to science. Would it? Nari asked. Or would it represent the most basic form, consciousness that hasn't been separated from experience by technology? The question hung in the air. Professor Veltara realized that everything they had assumed about the evolution of intelligence might be backwards. They had assumed that technological enhancement represented advancement. But what if it represented a deviation from something more fundamental? Professor, Nari continued, when you use your crystalline memory matrix to store information, where does the information go? Into the matrix storage system, Professor Veltara replied automatically. And when you want to access it? I retrieve it from the matrix. So the information exists separately from you. You have to go get it when you need it. Yes, that's how information storage works, Nari nodded. For humans, information doesn't exist separately from us. When we truly learn something, it becomes part of our consciousness structure. We don't retrieve it, we are it. Professor Yixtel pushed through the crowd to get closer. Student Nari, if what you're saying is true, it would mean that humans have achieved direct consciousness integration without technological assistance. Yes, that's supposed to be impossible. Why? Professor Yixtel opened his mouth to reply, then closed it. He realized he didn't have an answer that wasn't based on assumptions about what biological consciousness could do. Professor Veltara looked around the room at her colleagues and students. All of them were staring at the young human woman as if seeing her for the first time. Student Nari, she said quietly, you're telling us that humans don't just learn information. You integrate it into your consciousness the same way other species integrate survival experiences. Yes, Professor. And this is normal for your species? For humans who pay attention, yes. Professor Veltara felt something shift in her understanding of intelligence itself. What do you mean, humans who pay attention? For the first time since the conversation began, Nari smiled slightly. Not all humans develop this ability fully, Professor. It requires learning to treat information as if your life depends on it. It requires understanding that forgetting is a choice, not an inevitability. The room was completely silent now. Even the students in the hallway had stopped whispering. Professor, Nari said softly, you asked me why I don't take notes. The real answer is that taking notes would be like admitting that I might forget. And for a human who understands what forgetting really means, that's not an option. Professor Veltara stared at her human student. What does forgetting really mean? Nari's expression became serious. For my species, Professor, forgetting isn't just failure to remember. Forgetting is choosing to die. The lecture hall had become completely silent. Professor Veltara stood in front of Kim Nari, her forearms motionless, her crystalline skin cycling through colors that indicated deep thought and growing amazement. The hallway was packed with students and faculty who had come to witness what was turning into the most extraordinary academic discussion in the Institute's history. The weight of Nari's last statement hung in the air. For my species, Professor, forgetting isn't just failure to remember. Forgetting is choosing to die. Professor Veltara's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. Student Nari, that's a remarkable claim, but claims require evidence. In science, we don't accept theories without proof. Nari nodded calmly. Of course, Professor. How would you like me to prove it? The simple question caught Professor Veltara off guard. She had expected the human to make excuses or admit that her claims were exaggerated. Instead, Nari was offering to demonstrate something that should be impossible. Professor Veltara looked around the room at her colleagues. Professor Crintal from Consciousness Studies nodded encouragingly. Professor Yixtel from Evolutionary Biology leaned forward with intense interest. Even the students were watching with anticipation. Very well. Prove to me that you can retain and integrate complex information without technological assistance. What would you like me to demonstrate? Professor Veltara thought carefully. She needed to choose something that would truly test Nari's claims, something that no biological mind should be able to handle without help. Recite to me the complete lecture from our third week, the one about temporal mathematics across parallel dimensional frameworks. Include all equations, all theoretical proofs, and all the discussions we had about the implications. A murmur ran through the crowd. That had been one of the most complex lectures of the semester. Professor Veltara herself had spent weeks preparing it. The material covered 17 different mathematical systems, 43 theoretical frameworks, and dozens of interconnected concepts. Theckelon checked his bio-neural implant. Professor, that lecture contained over 800 distinct mathematical concepts and 23 major theoretical frameworks. My recording systems logged it as requiring 47 minutes and 16 seconds to deliver. And you want her to recite all of it from memory? Asked Vesasari, her gaseous form shimmering with disbelief. Yes, Professor Veltara said firmly. If student Nari can truly integrate information into her consciousness as she claims, then she should be able to reproduce that lecture completely. Nari stood up slowly. Would you like me to recite it exactly as you delivered it, or would you prefer me to explain the concepts in my own way? Exactly as I delivered it. Word for word, equation for equation. The room fell silent. Even the students in the hallway stopped breathing. This was impossible. No one could remember an entire advanced physics lecture word for word without recording it. Nari closed her eyes for a moment, as if focusing herself. When she opened them again, she began to speak. Today we will explore temporal mathematics across parallel dimensional frameworks, she began, her voice taking on the same tone and rhythm that Professor Veltara had used weeks earlier. This field represents one of the most challenging areas of theoretical physics because it requires us to calculate probability functions across multiple timeline streams. Simultaneously, she continued speaking. For the next 47 minutes, she delivered the entire lecture exactly as Professor Veltara had given it. Every word was perfect. Every equation was reproduced precisely, including the small correction Professor Veltara had made when she caught her own minor error halfway through the original lecture. But more than that, Nari wasn't just reciting memorized text. She was delivering the lecture with the same understanding and emphasis that Professor Veltara had used. When she reached complex concepts, she paused in the same places. When she explained difficult mathematics, she used the same gestures. She even reproduced the slight change in Professor Veltara's skin color that had occurred when she became excited about a particular theoretical breakthrough. The alien students and faculty stood transfixed. They were watching something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the limits of biological consciousness. When Nari reached the end of the lecture, she didn't stop there. She continued with perfect accuracy through the question and answer session that had followed. She reproduced Theckelon's question about dimensional stability, Professor Veltara's answer, and even the brief side discussion between two students about mathematical notation. When she finally finished, the lecture hall was dead silent. Professor Veltara's voice was barely audible. How many of our lectures can you do this with? All of them, Professor. But not just yours. Every lecture I've attended since arriving here, every conversation I've had, every book I've read. We don't selectively remember information, Professor. When we pay attention to something, we experience it completely. Professor Yixtel stepped forward, his voice filled with scientific excitement. Student Nari, what you just demonstrated represents a form of consciousness integration that we didn't think was possible. It's not integration, Professor. It's just consciousness operating the way it evolved to operate before technology changed how you think about information. Professor Krintal joined the conversation. But the computational requirements for what you just did should exceed biological neural capacity. Nari turned to look at him. Professor, you're thinking about this backwards. You're assuming that consciousness is a computer that processes information. But consciousness isn't separate from experience. Consciousness is experience. I don't understand the distinction. When you use technology to store information, you're treating your mind like a container that holds things. When humans integrate information, we're not storing it, we're becoming it. The mathematics I just recited isn't something I remember, it's something I am. Vesisari floated closer, her containment suit speakers crackling with excitement. You're saying that humans don't have information, humans become information. We become experience, Nari corrected. And complex information becomes complex experience. Professor Veltara was struggling to process the implications. Student Nari, if what you're demonstrating is normal for your species, it would mean that humans have developed the most advanced form of consciousness in the known galaxy. No, Professor. We've developed the most basic form. We just never learned to separate consciousness from experience, the way other species did when they developed technology. The room erupted in whispered conversations as students and faculty tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Professor Veltara held up her hands for silence. Student Nari, there's one more thing I need to understand. You said that not all humans develop this ability fully. What determines who does and who doesn't? Understanding what forgetting really costs, Nari replied simply. Humans who learn to treat all important information as survival information develop this ability. Humans who assume they can always look things up later don't. And you learn to treat academic information as survival information? For the first time since the conversation began, Nari's expression became serious. Professor, I came here representing my entire species. If I failed, it wouldn't just be my failure. It would be proof that humans aren't ready for galactic civilization. Every piece of information I encounter here isn't just academic knowledge. It's survival knowledge for my entire species. The implications of her words hit the room like a wave. Everyone suddenly understood that they had been watching more than just an academic demonstration. They had been witnessing the evolution of human consciousness under the pressure of species-level survival. Professor Veltara stared at her human student with new understanding. Student Nari, when you said that forgetting is choosing to die, I meant it literally, Professor. For me, forgetting anything I learn here could mean the death of human participation in galactic civilization, so I choose not to forget. Ever. Teclon's bioneural implant was processing frantically, but that level of consciousness integration should be impossible without technological enhancement. Nari looked at him with patient eyes. Honored classmate, you keep saying what should be impossible, but you're defining impossibility based on species that learned to rely on technology before they fully developed their natural consciousness abilities. She gestured around the room at all the recording devices and neural enhancers. All of you became dependent on external systems to handle information before you discovered what consciousness could do on its own. Humans never had that option. We had to develop consciousness to its fullest extent just to survive. Professor Veltara felt her understanding of intelligence and consciousness shifting fundamentally. You're saying that humans weaponized consciousness itself? No, Professor, Nari said quietly. We weaponized something much more dangerous than consciousness. We weaponized the refusal to forget. She picked up her simple notebook and walked toward the exit. The crowd of students and faculty parted to let her through. As she reached the doorway, she paused and turned back. Professor Veltara, you asked why I don't take notes. The complete answer is this. For a human who understands what survival really means,